Can we really carve a political solution into a global, societal and business problem? South Africa did well in both categories in 1994 after the failed Copenhagen Climate Change Summit failure. We do have to ask whether or not we can trust governments and politicians to agree on global climate regulation. It's all happening in Paris at the COP21 Summit to provide business with investment certainty. I'm Bruce Whitfield. This is The Moneymakers, and tonight we're joined via Skype from Paris by Jules Kortenhorst. He is the Chief Executive of RMI. And in Johannesburg, I'm joined by Joanne Yawitch, who is Chief Executive of the National Business Initiative. Jules, let's start with you in Paris. I mean, is it possible for politicians really to carve out our climatological future?
Politicians have an important role to play, and there is no doubt that without political leadership here in Paris, we are not going to forge a global deal. But the good news is, and maybe a big difference from where we are today in comparison to Copenhagen 6 years ago, is that it's no longer just dependent on politicians. Very different from 6 years ago, I see tremendous leadership now also coming from the business community, and business leaders, in fact, pushing government leaders and politicians to conclude an ambitious deal here. So the responsibility is much more shared across society now.
It can't work any other way, of course, but when we look at the issue of climate change and the targets that are set, the voluntary targets that are set, and the ambitions of the politicians, the intentions of the politicians may very well be honourable, but isn't the weakness of these agreements the fact that it is all voluntary?
Clearly, the more this agreement will commit and bind countries, the better. But what we learned in Copenhagen was that creating a fully legally binding agreement where all the countries would commit on a legal basis to the treaty, that was a step too far. And the interesting construct that has been designed now for Paris is this idea that countries first and foremost commit their own plans, their own determined plans that are in many cases much more important than what they pledge in the international community. And by adding up all these domestically committed plans, we get on our way, not all the way, but on our way to a trajectory that keeps us within the safe zone of 2 degrees.
Now, the safe zone of 2 degrees, just take me through the logic of this, please, because by the year 2100, the aim is to have global temperatures rise by no more than those 2 degrees, right?
That is absolutely right. And that is a controversial point. There are many countries, particularly those that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, that argue that even 2 degrees is too lower targets and risks us getting to unsustainable levels of warming. The big worry we all have, the big worry that we all have to share, is that of runaway climate change, of feedback loops, of instabilities in the climate system that take us very quickly from 2 degrees to 3 degrees to 4 degrees and beyond. And that's why scientists have warned us over and over again that 2 degrees is really the limit that we should hold on to.
Now, this is being achieved against a backdrop of the Chinese, for example, who say, well, they will reach peak carbon emissions by the year 2030. Who believes anyone else around the negotiating table in terms of, first, the self-interest of the need to grow economies, and in order to grow those economies, doing it in the cheapest and most traditional way possible, possibly?
Let's look at the situation in China. Just this morning, the air pollution in Beijing rated 560 parts per million, which basically means that it is 10 times higher than what the World Health Organization accepts as safe air pollution in a city setting. So the Chinese have a very clear self-interest to clean up their cities, to clean up their economy. The Chinese are also consistently delivering on commitments that they make. And in fact, just last year, as one example, China installed 14 gigawatts of solar power, more than the cumulative amount of solar that the United States has installed. So I would argue that the Chinese can actually be very much relied upon to deliver on their goals. They have a very organized and disciplined mechanism of setting 5-year plans and working hard to deliver on those. So in many ways, I'd say the Chinese commitment is one that you can take to the bank. And my organization, the Rocky Mountain Institute, has worked with the Chinese government over the last 2 years in an initiative called Reinventing Fire that illustrates that the path to 2030 peaking of carbon emissions is definitely a feasible one for China.
Jules Kortenhorst, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much from the Rocky Mountain Institute, Chief Executive Officer on Skype from Paris, where he's attending the COP21 meeting. Joanne Yawitch, you're going to the COP21 meeting as well. What do you hope to gain?
I am, Bruce, and I think that from the perspective of South African business, we have been working over the last year to look at how companies in South Africa can act on climate, what it is that they can be doing now and into the future that would support a positive outcome to the COP in Paris, and a positive outcome would be ultimately a legally binding agreement. So there's been work done by South African companies. And internationally in the business community, climate is big business. There's a huge increase in renewable investments around the world. Jules was talking about the Chinese.
It's a considerable layout, for example, in terms of renewable energy. They alone have done as much as the rest of the world combined.
They have indeed. They have indeed. But if you look at South Africa, if you look at us, we are rolling out, have started to roll out, and are going to roll out around 6,000 megawatts in the next short while of renewables in South Africa.
Yet at the same time, we continue to build Medupi and Kusile. We still continue to look at a long-term coal future. Eskom is one of the world's great polluters.
So in South Africa, we have locked ourselves into a coal future for at least the next 40 years with Medupi and Kusile. But in that, we aren't different to many other developing countries. So what I think you see happening in the developing world, a country like India is very similar to South Africa, is large investment in renewables and at the same time continued use of coal. And I think it goes back in the climate negotiations to this debate about the relationship between climate change and development, and how historically many of the existing emissions in the atmosphere come through the Industrial Revolution. And you've got Europe sitting pretty on the basis of historical emissions, and the developing world hasn't grown yet. So that's one argument. But I think that what we're seeing is we can
argue the politics and the history of climate change as much as we like. It doesn't change the outcome. The outcome is a scary future where if we don't get some kind of consensus globally on capping emissions and lowering emissions, we are going to face a very warm future, or at least our children and grandchildren are going to face very warm and uncertain futures.
And I think particularly in an African context we are going to. So when we talk about a 2-degree future for the world at large, in South Africa we're talking about between a 3 and a 6-degree future. So it's hugely in our interests as a country, and it has impacts on our agricultural economy, on our water resources, on the ability of industry to operate.
But also, I mean, human beings are nothing if not self-serving. We look at the situation today. Should I take a bus, or should I jump into my car by myself and sit in the traffic for half an hour, burning fossil fuels and spewing all kinds of toxins into the atmosphere? Or should I catch that bus? Should I catch that train? Or should I even walk the short distance to my office? 99% of us today still jump into their car, we still sit in the traffic, we still serve our needs today. Is there any way, other than facing the certainty of a really miserable long-term future, that we can change people's approach to this?
Okay, so I suppose that is where the issue of an international agreement and national level frameworks and policy and regulation comes in, because I think that you actually do need both incentives and disincentives. So in a South African context, I think the one disincentive for business that we're certainly debating very vigorously, business and government, is the issue of carbon taxing, putting a price on carbon. In the South African context, it's a carbon tax which is pretty unpopular with a lot of business.
It's massively unpopular, but is it necessary?
I certainly think that a price on carbon is necessary. I think the carbon
is it ever
is
going to be high
an
enough to be
externality.
punitive enough? Is there ever going to be more than just petty cash for government to go and spend on another Medupi or
Okay,
Kusile?
so I think that the issue of a price on carbon is an important thing because I think it does price an externality. I'm not certain that a carbon tax is necessarily the right instrument through which to do it. So if you look at carbon markets internationally.
But that's also something that gets to really gets into my craw, because I look at carbon markets, so you can do carbon offsets. So you can pollute to high heaven on this side of the world, but you can offset it by planting a tree on the other side of the world. Hold on a second. Is that really the spirit of what we're trying to do here?
I think the spirit is ultimately that we need to bring emissions down in absolute terms. I think that certainly offsets have their place as a net neutrality mechanism.
Is South Africa coming to the party in terms of COP21 and future COPs?
So I think South Africa is coming to the party. I mean, I think for South Africa as a country, South Africa's worked very hard to try and get an agreement, I think, to contribute to this Paris Agreement. In part because Paris realizes the commitments made in Durban in 2011. What is being negotiated is something called the Durban Platform, and it ends up in a post-2020 agreement. So I think South Africa's stands very strongly behind the need for an agreement. I think that the corporate sector in South Africa has actually also, over the last 5 or 7 years, become a leader in relation to climate action. So if you look at carbon disclosure in South Africa, South African companies are leaders both in terms of their disclosure as well as their performance. If you look at the performance of the top 100 on the JSE compared to others around the world, we really do very well. I think the question in South Africa is how do you get critical mass? And at the moment, I think that in climate action, what you have is the large corporates in the economy, in the South African economy, are involved. They see climate as a real risk issue and as a real issue to manage the impacts of, but it's to be able to get that to be a much broader issue. And
get us to change, and change our habits, of course, as well. Jules Kortenhorst, who's the Chief Executive of the Rocky Mountain Institute, he joined us on Skype from Paris. And in our Johannesburg studio, Joanne Yawitch, who's Chief Executive of the National Business Initiative, off to Paris in a carbon-emitting jet to go and talk about carbon emissions. It was one of the best things, of course, about the Al Gore movie, of course, An Inconvenient Truth, which changed many people's perceptions about climate and climate change. But he did it from an aeroplane, dropping thousands of tons of carbon. One of the great ironies, of course, of this whole debate. That's where we'll leave it for this evening. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, bye-bye.